Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram namashrishtam manumapi shachiputramadra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim goshtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham prapto yasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi pancha kalpatarubhyascha kripas sindubhyaiva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah namo mahavaranyaya krishna prema pradayate krishnaya krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah jayatam surato pango mama mandamate gati matsarvasva parambujo radha madana mohano kuladi devatamor madana mohan jar sevak raghunatha rup sanatan jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala dasa raghunath Echai goshai kori charana vandan jaha hoite vignanasha bhishta puram adadana stridam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dulisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, by whom his heart's desire was fulfilled, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. So today we start a new prakaran called Prema Saubhagya, or the fortune of Prema. So we concluded last time the prakaran on Bhajana Mahatmya, or the greatness of worship of Krishna in general. So now, although Prema is not something different than Bhajan, but rather the superlative state of bhajan, it's given its own prakaran, and some special praise is discussed of that most exalted form of bhajan. So we'll begin that today with the first verse, but I have a little bit of, based on the commentator's introduction to the section, I've added a little bit of elaboration, drawing in elements from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So we'll start from there. So in the previous verse, we heard about how bhakti is such that not only can it eradicate sin, it can even eradicate samsara as a whole. It can even lead to the attainment of moksha, or lead to a state in which it's as if the goddess of mukti is rolling at your feet, begging to be accepted. So, having stated this, then we can draw the line of thought between the previous verse and the following verse by saying these are external experiences, or these are the potential, the effect that bhakti has to create external changes or negation of negative elements. It can negate conditioning of samsara. It can negate the presence of sin. It can negate the presence of kama. All these points have been discussed in the previous verses, but simply negating the negative is not inherently positive, or is not in and of itself the ultimate thing. So in the verse that we'll discuss now, we can say that we shift from the power of bhakti to negate negative elements to the power of bhakti to produce the ultimate positive element, or the power of bhakti to produce joy or bliss within the heart. So that's where the discussion goes next. And I've just included here, because the section is entitled prema sobhagya, then to underscore what is meant specifically by prema, then I've given here the definitions of Uttama Bhakti in general, as well as the 3 degrees of self-manifestation of Uttama Bhakti, namely Sadhana Bhakti, Bhava Bhakti, and Prem Bhakti. So, the definition of Uttama Bhakti is as follows, translated on Nibilashita Shunyam, this verse: continuous action for or related to Krishna, possessed of favorability, that is free from desirousness of anything else, and unobstructed by jnana, karma, and so forth, is called exalted or Uttama Bhakti. So we've had classes on this verse in the past. We've gone through Jiva Goswami's commentary, Vishnu Chakravarti's commentary, so I'm not going to elaborate on any of this at this time. But as an essential overview, the intrinsic characteristic is that any action possessed of favorability, namely activity pleasing to Krishna, is the constitution of bhakti, and the extrinsic characteristics of bhakti is that there's no intent within such action for any object other than bhakti itself, or other than the satisfaction of Krishna. And there's no dependence upon or limitation by involvement with the path of jnana or karma or whatever. Bhakti is an independent, self-positive or self-effective entity. That very bhakti, Uttam Bhakti, as explained in the following chapter, is then said to have 3 degrees of self-manifestation. Its full manifestation, the beginning of its full or primary self, and then its initial installment where it's not in its full form, but where it's just starting to enter and in the stage of preparing or removing everything that ought not be in its midst, and exerting or implanting the necessary prerequisites for its full manifestation. A little bit like the way you can download an installer, and then you run the installer, and then the app starts. Something like this. Sadhana Bhakti is like the installer, and then the installer runs on the psyche and removes all the files that are incompatible and installs all the necessary files and the necessary folders, lays down the samskaras and lays down this and that. And then when all that's in place, then bhav. Then you can have this experience and you can relish this thing called prema and feel this thing called minus or loving attachment to Krishna and the bliss that arises from that and so forth. So, sadhana bhakti is defined as that aspect of Uttama Bhakti which is accomplished by action of the senses and by which Bhava Bhakti is to be accomplished. So in other words, sadhana bhakti is that the aim of which is Bhava Bhakti and which is performed with the senses. Manifestation of eternally accomplished bhava into the heart is the intended sense of it and of its being an object to be accomplished. So this is technical language. We'll get into this later in the classes on the Chaitanya Charitamrita where this point is discussed there, so I won't elaborate on this now. But in essence, bhakti is constituted of Sarup Shakti. It's ever existent and it's just downloading, or it's just self-manifesting into the citta, so it's not being produced by activity of the senses, but rather these activities of the senses are facilitating its manifestation. So therefore, it's only a, quote, object to be accomplished in the sense that it's being brought into manifestation, not that it's being produced or created by sensory activity. This is the principle he's clarifying there. So then Bhava Bhakti is that aspect of Uttama Bhakti which is constituted of a special aspect of pure existence or Shuddha Sattva, or other words, Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, is a bearer of resemblance to a ray of the sun of Prema, and is a melter of the heart with hankerings, is called Bhava Bhakti. So these hankerings, Jiva Gosvami explains in his commentary, are desire for Krishna, desire for anukulya, or in other words, to do action pleasing to Krishna, and then to have or to experience affection in exchange with Krishna. So these hankerings are what melt the heart. So this is significant, that it is desire that has this melting or this powerful effect over the heart. So when bhava appears, then, or when the sense of identity of being Bhagavan's own and being a particular type of servant or associate of Bhagavan is there in the mind, then with the attachment to Bhagavan that is based upon that sense of self or that abhiman, there arises these desires for Bhagavan, for serving him, for his love, for things of that nature. And then those desires lead to this meltedness of the heart as those things are achieved and experienced. And then ultimately, Prema Bhakti is defined as that very bhava, or the aforementioned bhava bhakti, upon becoming intense in nature, marked by extreme minus, or loving attachment, and that because of which the heart becomes completely melted, is called Prema Bhakti. So, anyway, I'm not elaborating on these definitions. In other classes, we'll go into the commentaries of Jiva Goswami and others on all these things. But just as a skeleton overview, this is to show that if we're talking about the fortune of prema, then what is this prema that we're talking about? We're talking about this prema meaning prema bhakti, meaning the ultimate self-manifestation of bhakti, which is profoundly blissful, characterized principally by a sense of extreme loving attachment, or a sense of, quote, my-ness in relation to Bhagavan, such that nothing is more dear to him, to oneself, than him, not even oneself to oneself, but even his dearness to oneself eclipses the self's dearness to the self, because he is ultimately perceived to be the supreme self. This is one way that Jiva Goswami gives the grounds for prema being the ultimate prayojanam in the Tattva Sandarbha, that because he's the self of the self, there can be no more worthy ultimate object of attachment or love than him. And then when that type of attachment is situated, it becomes prominent in the heart, then how will the heart not completely melt and become overjoyed by just the thought of him, but to speak of remembrance of his activities or his gestures or his figure or all of the other wonders that are found in his nature. So, now we'll come to the verses here in the Padyavali. So, by bringing up this section called the fortune of Prema, then what we hear about are what happens in the heart of a bhakta who has this type of Prema. So the first verse shows how Prema is something that is, I'll just read what I have here. In the first verse of this section, he cites a verse that describes how Prema is of far greater value than mere acts of worship or bhakti devoid of loving attachment to Bhagavan, and the meltedness of the heart that comes about as a result of that loving attachment. So here we can say that there's a distinction drawn loosely between prema and, quote, bhajan, or puja, or archan, or worship in general, because worship can be performed with all kinds of attitudes. Worship can be performed as, by robbers, as a means of getting into a temple to rob the place, as we hear about in different ancient stories about, thieves who show up at temples and participate in the arati just to be able to see what kind of paraphernalia is in the temple, if they want to steal it or not, So you can do puja, you can do bhakti or bhajan with, the opposite of anything close to love, with, intense ill intent. You can do puja as a mere formality to please your parents or please your spouse or please, whoever's in society, or participate in a political function. I remember sometimes when I would visit Malaysia, we would go to these temple programs, and the local politicians would come to them. Sometimes the, local, it's a Muslim country, so most of the politicians are Muslims, but they would come to the Hindu temples and they would act all respectful, but it was so obvious that they were not there to worship the deity by any means. They were just there to, show that they allow the Hindus to do that to get their votes. So they're, showing some respect, but, it's just something of a purely social, political motivation. So like this, whether it's an ill intent or a conventional intent, or more broadly, it's a sense of reverence, whatever it is, puja can be done, formal worship can be done with all different kinds of attitudes. So what's specified here is that it's prema that really brings joy to the heart. It's prema that melts the heart, not the worship, not the literal ritual that is performed. So this is the distinction that's emphasized here. So let's come to it. So ata prema bhagyam. Now the fortune of prema. nānopacāra-kṛta-pūjanam ārta-bandhoḥ premṇaiva bhakta hṛdayaṁ sukha-vidrutaṁ syāt yāvat asti jaṭhare jaraṭhā pipāsā tāvat sukhāya bhavato nanu bhakṣya-peye. O bhakta, worship performed with articles of the friend of the distressed is separate. The heart shall become melted with joy only because of prema. Oh, as long as there is vigorous hunger and thirst in the stomach, food and drink are certainly pleasing. So this is a vivid example. Everyone knows that feeling of the food no longer tasting any good at all when one is sick or one is full or whatever the case may be. When you have no hunger, there's no pleasure in food. So similarly, when you have no real love, puja is boring. Puja is just a formality. Puja is just some ritual that you have to do, or it's just some social obligation, or it's just something that you do while you're half distracted, or whatever. So as hunger gives rise to relish in food, so it is prema, or so it is love, that gives rise to joy in doing worship or in doing service. People might do the very same activities that they do all day at their 9-to-5 job that they do for their family members when they get home. If someone has a job cleaning houses or cooking food or something like this, they might come home and clean their house or cook food or do the very same thing, but one might be, a tedious, laborious task, and the other might be an act of joy if they're excited to receive their friends and family over for a gathering, and it's an act of joy and love to tidy the place and prepare the food, to make gestures of affection for their dear ones. So activities in themselves are not where the relish is, but it's in the spirit of the activity that where the relish of the activity comes. And even very plain, very ordinary activities can be profoundly relishable when they're done out of great love or for someone who we greatly love. This is, in gist, the point. So, but we'll look at this, and there's some numerous interpretations given of this verse, so we'll look at a few of them as we go through the commentary here. So the commentator specifies that when we're talking about worship performed with articles, then in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, in other texts, you have different formal regimens by which ritual worship is performed, what they call panchopasana, or panchopacāra-kṛta-pūjanam, shodashopacāra-kṛta-pūjanam, 5 articles or 16 articles. Hari Bhakti Vilas, I think, says 5, 10, 12, 16, it has some numbers, and then there's 64, and different styles, different traditions are there about certain sets of articles. So he's saying what's referred to here is all of that. In other words, it's not like just some articles, but if there were more, then it would be great. Or when you have one of those big stacks with 108 wicks, then you really feel joy automatically. No. However many articles you have, however grand they are, however expensive they are, however artistic they are, whatever, that the heart does not melt with joy simply by performing a ritual of worship. And the name of Bhagavan given in this verse is ārta-bandhoḥ, or he who is the friend of the distress, essentially meaning he who relieves the distress of the distressed. So no amount of standard formality is really going to bring joy to the heart. Rather, the heart becomes melted with joy only when prema manifests therein, and worship is performed as an expression of prema. So this is the first meaning. I think it's clear. So now we'll come to the second meaning. And the second meaning is predicated upon a different interpretation of the first word. So if we look at the very beginning of the verse, it's in compound, it says nānopacāra. So that's a compound of nana and upachara. And there are some English translations that render the whole thing as one compound and interpret the word nana as various, which is a common meaning of the word nana. So they just take it to mean worship performed with various articles, which would be a likely reading. However, the commentator on the Padyavali, the Sri Viracandra Gosvami Prabhupada, in his Rasika-rangada-tika, he gives two interpretations. Neither interpretation is that interpretation. And we'll also discuss two interpretations that are in the commentary attributed to Vishwanath Chakravarti on the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And he doesn't give, neither of his interpretations are of that nature either. So I've omitted that type of interpretation from our discussion here, although it is plausible. So anyhow, the word nana, rather than, can also carry, in addition to meaning various, can also mean without, as well as separate. So in the first meaning, the first interpretation, it was given as separate. In other words, worship is separate, and love is separate. Love is the real thing, worship is the form that may be an expression of prema or not. That's interpretation one. And the second interpretation is if we take it as without. So this is interesting. The meaning becomes like this. O bhakta, even without worship performed with articles of the friend of the distressed, the heart shall become melted with joy just because of prema. So if you have prema for Bhagavan, you don't even need to do puja. In other words, it's not that you'll only feel some joy when you do some worship and that's how you feel connected to Bhagavan. If you have prema for Bhagavan, he's with you in your heart, you're aware of him at every moment. Whether you're doing some ritual or not becomes irrelevant. So that's how it goes in the second interpretation, which is also nice. So worthy of including both, I would say. So in the case of either interpretation, the meaning of the heart, quote, becoming melted with joy, is that the heart feels so much joy that it becomes melted. This is the commentator, he even takes the time to make this point, although it's quite obvious. I thought it was nice that he wanted to make sure that was clear. Not that it's melted and it's joyful, but that there's so much joy that it's melting. The joy is the cause of the melting. So it is to be understood. Now you might say, well, why? Why is the joy coming? Or where is the joy causing the melting coming from? So he explains that it is to be understood that this melting of the heart occurs as a result of, quote, mamatva, or minus, in relation to Bhagavan. So that's one of the reasons that I included that definition of prema from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu prior to this verse, so that it would be clear that this commentary is spot on with Rupa Goswami's line of thought. Because Rupa Goswami is saying, mamata atishayonkita, that prema is characterized by profound mamata. And it's the mamata that's giving rise to the joy, and it's the joy that's giving rise to the melting. So in that way, we can gather the sense of how this is taking place in the psyche. So, this melting of the heart occurs as a result of minus in relation to Bhagavan, since minus is an essential defining feature of Prema Bhakti. And that point is further illustrated in a verse that Rupa Goswami cites in the Sindhu as evidence for the definition that he gives. So that verse of the Narad Pancharatra is translated as follows: Bhakti possessed of minus in relation to Vishnu and free from minus in relation to all else is called Prema by Bhishma, Prahlad, Uddhava, and Narada. So, Ananya Mamata Vishnu, Mamata Prema Sangata. So the implied sense in this regard is that the heart becomes joyful and melted in proportion to the extent that minus in relation to Bhagavan becomes manifest therein. And then, I mentioned this earlier, it is to be understood from Jiva Gosvami Pad's commentary that minus in relation to Bhagavan gives rise to this desire to attain Bhagavan, the desire to serve so as to satisfy Bhagavan, and the desire to engage in exchanges of affection with him, and the heart is caused to melt by these desires. So, according to the Sankhya, if we want to look at this a little bit broader from a psychological perspective, or what we might call Bhagavat psychology, according to the Bhagavatam, the psyche has 4 fundamental elements: the chitta, the ahankar, the buddhi, and the manas. And one of the defining characteristics of the Bhagavat Samkhya, or the Bhagavat psychology, that distinguishes it from the Samkhya darshan and other spheres of Indian philosophy, is that the ahankar is defined as fundamental to the buddhi and the manas in the Bhagavat Samkhya, or in the Bhagavat psychology. Which is to say that, and the ahankar's faculty is that which produces the sense of I and the sense of my. What's called ahankar and mamakar, according to Sri Darsami. So, from this sense of I and sense of my, all of the functioning of the buddhi takes place. And all of the emotion, cognition, etc. in the manas takes place. So the ahankar, the mamakar, pervades every single conscious psychological function. This is how the Bhagavat psychology is built, so to speak. So, according to how the ahankar, the mamakar, the sense of I, the sense of my, is attuned, so all cognitive faculties will function, or so all cognitive functions or vrittis will take place. So, when that core orienting element of the psyche is tuned to the material body of I'm this body, its activities are mine, I get the credit for what it does, and I try to avoid getting the credit when it does something that other people don't like, and all of this stuff. This is all what is perpetuating our entanglement in samsara. So the whole system of Uttama Bhakti sadhana is to essentially reprogram the psyche such that it has a different sense of I and a different sense of my. To build in the sense of I as being a particle of consciousness that's inherently belongs to Bhagavan, that fundamental sense of I as being a conscious part, which is by nature a servant, or has its fundamental function of service to Bhagavan. And then beyond that, to cultivate a sense of I, of being a particular type of associate of Bhagavan, whose very nature, form, activities, everything are as per the preferences of Bhagavan, and whose very existence is for the pleasure of Bhagavan. To cultivate that sense of I will be to, retune the sense of self or abhiman towards what is the goal of one's existence, rather than to what is the anchor in one's suffering. So this inversion, or this readjustment of the sense of I, is the thing that is to be fostered throughout every feature of bhakti sadhana, and is meant to be nourished through all of the practices that are to be done. And it's through that shift in the sense of I that there will come a shift in the sense of my. So once I have the sense of I am for Bhagavan, I am a servant of Bhagavan, my purpose is to please Bhagavan, then what becomes my, or what becomes dear to me, what becomes important to me, what becomes the object of my attachment? Bhagavan, Bhagavan's service, things related to Bhagavan's service. The sense of my becomes entirely integrated into him and all that is related to him and his pleasure, etc. So in that way, prema is defined as that which is characterized by profuse my-ness in relation to Bhagavan. So to establish these ideals, or to establish the ideal, to say that prema is my prayojana, on a psychological level, is to say that I will foster a sense of identity of being a servant of Bhagavan or a particular type of associate of Bhagavan, and I will foster a sense of loving attachment or a sense of my solely in relation to what is for him, or of him, with him, to him, and satisfying for him, etc. So when that sense of I and that sense of my are there, then these desires that are mentioned here, the desire for Bhagavan, the desire to serve Bhagavan, the desire to experience his love, these things will become completely automatic. They'll become the natural inclination of the mind. And under their influence, the heart will become completely melted insofar as one experiences those things. And knowing how gracious Bhagavan is, that he's so gracious that he's satisfied even by people who he's satisfied by Putana even dressing up like a gopi. Even though he's trying to kill him. Just the fact that she even had the tact to come in such a nice disguise. If he can take pleasure in that, then we have much to hope for. Or we have much to be hopeful about his gracious disposition towards our aspiration. Anyhow, that topic will come a little bit later in the next verse, but we won't go further into that at this moment. So anyhow, this is some psychological perspective on the idea of the melting of the heart and how prema exists as you could say, a reality or a state of mind. So, related to this, the commentator adds a little bit more. He says that he quotes this verse, which I couldn't trace. He attributes it to the Brahma Puran, but I couldn't find it there, so it must be somewhere out there. Anyhow, it just illustrates the point that's made so far in the interpretation that he gives of the verse. So I'll just read the translation to save time. It says, "Fish live in the Ganga and other holy places, and birds dwell in temples. But they are devoid of bhava, however. Because they are devoid of bhava, however, they do not attain the benefit from even the foremost of holy places and temples. That is, they do not experience the joy of being in those places, especially related to Bhagavan. That is experienced, by persons endowed with bhava for Sri Bhagavan." So sometimes we hear Baba make this point. I remember him, I think it was it Atula Krishna Goswami or Nishringa Ballabh Goswami? I can't remember. One of the very famous lecturers from the 80s in Vrindavan, Baba sometimes recalls hearing him that he would often say when he was lecturing in Vrindavan, he would say, "Look in the Jamuna! There's so many turtles! Look at the turtles!" like kind of heavily, like look at all these turtles. They're up at 4 a.m. taking bath in the Jamuna in the winter. Where's their prey? Kind of a little bit like chastising the Babajis, kind of saying, you can do all these austerities, you can be all like hardcore, whatever. These turtles are more hardcore than you'll ever be. They don't even wear clothes. They're in the freezing cold Jamuna. They're taking bath every day. But, what is the value of that? Or what experience do they ultimately have? From a broad perspective, we can say, no doubt, the jivas in those bodies are blessed. We're not trying to discount that. But the point of the statement is exactly what's stated here in this verse, that unless one is consciously aware and understanding and able to appreciate what it means to take a bath in the Jamuna, what it means to be in Vrindavan, what it means to worship Krishna, what is worship of Krishna, what is love of Krishna, unless those things are there, simply doing these activities or physically being in these places doesn't actually directly produce any type of relishable or significant conscious experience. So just as without hunger, without thirst, food, drink isn't relishable, without this bhav, without this awareness, without this prema, even being in these places is not such a wonderful thing. You know, I've seen sometimes tourists at the Mathura train station going to Agra or something like that. You know, it's nothing to them. This is just some train station, whatever. It's just another dirty, kind of sketchy Indian place. Like, this is nothing of significance to them, because they don't know what it is. They don't have any framework. They don't have the samskar to appreciate it. So this is the point. You know, being made in a broad way, that when there is prema, there is relish. When there is hunger, there is relish. When there is taste for the thing, in other words. Okay, so those are the two interpretations given by Viracandra Gosvami Prabhupada. So now we're going to come to, I'm adding to this here, that this verse is a statement of Ramananda Rai, and it's found in the Ramananda Sangvad. In the Ramananda Sangvad, when Ramananda is answering Mahaprabhu's initial question, Paro Shlok Sadir Nirnoy, recite a verse which tells me the ultimate aim to be achieved. And as Ramananda is going in a gradation through successive ideals, when he comes to describe Prema Bhakti, then he quotes this verse of his own composition to illustrate what is Prema. So that's also significant. And in the commentary on the Sanskrit commentary on the Charitamrita that's attributed to Vishnu Chakravarti, he gives a commentary on this verse. And he interprets the verse a little bit differently, but also interestingly. So now we'll discuss those comments. So what's different about his commentary is that if we look at the verse, there's this phrase ārta-bandhoḥ, which is a genitive form of ārta-bandhu. In other words, the name of Bhagavan is in the possessive case. So you can interpret the verse in two ways, because you can say that the pujanam, the worship, is of Bhagavan, or you can take the possessiveness to apply to the worship. And that's how Viracandra Gosvami has interpreted. But the way it's given in this other commentary is the word hṛdayaṁ is taken to be the thing possessed by ārta-bandhoḥ. So the heart of Bhagavan is, the possessiveness is applied to the word for heart rather than to the worship. So when you apply the genitive case there, then the meaning becomes as follows. O bhakta, the heart of the friend of the distressed shall become melted with joy when worship is performed with articles only because of prema. So in other words, in the first interpretation, he's saying that the bhakta's heart will melt only when they have prema, or only when they do puja with prema. And in the second interpretation, he's saying Bhagavan's heart will melt only when the bhakta does worship with prema. So that's also true. we also hear that, you know, it's only in the Vaishishtya, or the special characteristics of bhakti that are initially listed in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Kleshagni, Shubhara Moksha Lotagutakrit Sudurlabha, Sandrananda Visheshatma, Sri Krishna Karshini Chasa. The sixth, or the highest special characteristic of bhakti that's mentioned there, that it can captivate Krishna, or it can attract Krishna, Chakravarti Pad comments that is a characteristic specifically of Prema Bhakti. So to say that this Prema melts the heart of Bhagavan, or compels the heart of Bhagavan, or has a pull on the heart of Bhagavan, that is also consistent with Rupa Goswami's siddhānta. So to say that the heart of Bhagavan will be melted only because of prema, this is also perfectly acceptable. And he gives a second interpretation as follows: O bhakta, even without worship performed with articles, the heart of the friend of the distressed shall become melted with joy just because of prema. And so he uses the same dual interpretation of the word nana. So you can say it's not that you have to do puja to melt Bhagavan's heart. If you have prema for Bhagavan, his heart will melt just by your prema, whether you do puja or not. This is the implication of the second interpretation. So in the case of these interpretations, the illustration of food and drink not being pleasing without hunger and thirst, being present in the stomach, implies that worship performed with articles did not melt Bhagavan's heart with joy when it is not an expression of prema on the heart of the bhakta, on the part of the bhakta. So that's what we have for this verse. And then we come to the following verse, which is also quoted by Ramananda Rai in the Ramananda Sangvad, right after or right with this verse that we just discussed, to illustrate what is prema bhakti. So they go right next to each other in the Ramananda Sangvad, and they come right next to each other here in the Padyavali. And this next verse, I've perhaps gotten a little carried away and written an elaborated commentary, so I don't want to jump into that right now, because I don't even know if we'll get through the whole commentary in one class as a whole. And it'll probably be the longest commentary on any verse in this book. But because this book primarily deals with description of Krishna's beauty and Leela and activities in Vrindavan and so forth, there isn't directly discussion of sadhan bhakti tattva or the details of the process of bhakti, as that is what he deals with in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Then I thought, at least here where the essence of those elements is alluded to, then we could go over some gist discussion of that whole process, which is the basis of why we're reading this book, or what we're doing by reading this book is trying to do that process. So I thought we could have an overview of what that process is, so that as we go through this text and as we hear about the form, the names, the forms, the qualities, the leelas, the associates, the abode, and so forth of our Ishta Devata, that will have all the more presence of mind to appreciate how valuable and how blessed that activity is. So I'll stop here for today, and in our next class we'll dive into this next verse, which is quite well known and very important. So if anyone wants to comment or ask anything or correct anything on today's discussion, please feel free. Yes?
Baba. Thank you very much for the class. I have a question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but Prema is in its constitution is Svarup Shakti, right?
Yes.
And when we are talking about Prema on the stage of when Sattaka reaches the stage when Prema becomes manifested in his heart, and Sattaka still being manifestation in its constitution of the Tatastha Shakti, I'm wondering how does this perception of the Svarup Shakti occurs by Sattaka? In other words, because Svarup Shakti is never mixed with any other types of Shakti. It never becomes mixed with Tatastha Shakti or Bhakaranga Shakti. So I'm wondering, how does it become manifest in the heart of the Sattaka, who is Tatastha Shakti, if it's never been mixed with the Tatastha Shakti? Or if it's not being mixed with it, how does this perception of Svarup Shakti on like experiential level occurs for the Sattaka? If I'm being clear, I'm just trying to understand this mechanism from the point of view of the physical energies. If I can describe it like this, how does this perception of the Swarup Shakti occurs by the sadhaka who is being in its constitution Tatastha Shakti? Like how this like conjoint perception occurs?
So the constitution of the jiva doesn't change. The jiva is Tatastha Shakti, it remains such, but it becomes influenced by Swarup Shakti. So it becomes a little bit of semantic, sort of language gets a little fuzzy at this point where mixture, touching, contact, influence, it can be a little bit hazy, what exactly is going on. So it's true that, so to speak, wherever the Swarup Shakti is present, the Maya Shakti is not. Where there is light, there is no darkness. This is one way of seeing things. But at the same time, we can say that the Swarup Shakti also pervades or exists in the midst of the world. It exists in the form of bhakti in the hearts of bhaktas. And as far as I like to believe, there's lots of bhaktas in the world, and there's lots of such Shakti in their hearts. So it's not that, it's like some bomb that like goes off and then everything else is just blasted away and there's nothing there. It does, so to speak, commingle to some extent. So it gets a bit esoteric. There are some discussion of this by Chakravarti Pad in his Bhagavatam commentary, and also by Jiva Gosvami in his comments on the Sindhu. In particular, this is discussed in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, chapter 3, I think it's verse 3 and 4, where it explains that that bhava bhakti, which is constituted of Swarup Shakti, manifests into the vrittis of the manas. Okay, so the mind is functioning, and the mind becomes imbued with, or it becomes, it functions under the effect of, or essentially becomes like amalgamated with the Swarup Shakti. Such that, from one perspective, it's as though the senses of the bhakta, the psyche of the bhakta, becomes Swarup Shakti. Or Swarup Shakti takes on the function of the senses and the mind of that bhakta. This is the way it's described. And it's with then those senses that are controlled by or have now been imbued with or taken over by the Swarup Shakti, that then the bhakta is able to have perception of Bhagavan, or have perception of that which is an object which is constituted of Swarup Shakti. Because senses, a mind constituted of the Maya Shakti will not perceive elements of the Swarup Shakti. But when the Swarup Shakti comes in and does the work of the mind and senses, then those mind and senses can perceive objects also constituted of Swarup Shakti. So Rupa Goswami describes this in gist in the Sindhu, how the bhava bhakti comes into the functions that are taking place in the mind, or it appears within the psyche. And by doing so, it essentially, loosely speaking, spiritualizes the mind, such that the mind functions as though it is, of a spiritual nature, or of the nature of Shuddha Sattva. And thereby, it's able to perceive Bhagavan, it's able to host bhakti, and experience, the bliss of Prema, the bliss that's also a product of the Swarup Shakti, and so forth. And there's some more detailed explanations. I can give you some, if you want to read the commentaries directly, I can give you some links. But in gist, this is the idea. So we have all this terminology, where initially we cut these sharp edges of like black, white, separate, but in practice, it gets all very kind of together in the sense that, on the one hand, bhaktas appear to have bodies that we can see with our eyes and that get old and that get sick and that emit smells and all of this that looks as mundane as anything could be. And then at the same time, we have this theology that tells us that the bhakta, from the moment that the bhakta is accepted by Bhagavan, surrenders to Bhagavan, that bhakta's body is now chinmoy, and the mind, everything about that bhakta is chinmoy. There's no prarabdha karma happening there. It's just the unfolding of Bhagavan's will. And so it's more ultimately about the faith that we have in the process than the technicalities of which Shakti is functioning where to what extent. And so some of the commentators have tried to come in and kind of draw very careful lines about how much which Shakti is active at which stage, and we can intellectually analyze that to a certain extent, and that can be interesting for some at a particular stage, but ultimately how much analytical knowledge we have of the technicalities of what is exactly functioning where won't be the deciding factor in our destiny. Just as, how well we know what, parts in the engine are functioning while we're riding in a car doesn't have all that much bearing on whether we'll get to our destination. I don't mean to belittle the technical siddhānta excessively with that example. There is important value in knowing these things, and the acaryas have taken the time to explain them, and we study them, and it's there, it's important, but at the same time it's not all important. Or if someone even didn't have full technical knowledge in that respect, but was attuned to what is of primary importance, then those things will essentially come about of their own accord. Those things they'll work. In other words, that Shakti is smarter than we'll ever be, and it knows how to do its job. It knows how to descend and function and exert its effect as is appropriate. So that'll work in our favor as blessed and as sincere as we are able to be. So I'll just leave it at that. If you're interested in more technical information, I can direct you to the relevant passages.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Baba.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so thank you so much. The topic of Prema is really picking up now, and I was wondering. I have many questions, but basically, I would like to, because I'm not very familiar with this text, and I was wondering if this text goes more deeper into describing Krishna's beauty, charm, behavior.
Oh yeah, just you wait.
I'm just waiting for that. See, my hidden question is, okay, we talk about technicalities of how Prema manifests, Svarup Shakti, all these technicalities, I'm just impatient. Okay, where's the rasa? Give me some juice.
Okay, well, do your best. Just, a few more verses. Try, hang on there, pal.
Oh,
life is tough.
Awesome. And another, following, hidden question again. Would you, going ahead of all of this, what we do now, but would you attempt to do some, Rasa Shastra? I'm not saying that Padyavali is not. Other books like Padyavali and other Raghunathas to have this kind of elaboration on those texts like we do right now? Do you have this in mind too?
Yeah, we may get to that in time.
Well,
some sections of Padyavali I quite like, and Stavavali is also nice. We can make time for those. Why not?
No, it just came to my mind the Upadeshamrita, which is very, very 11 verses book. How would it fit into the canon of those, or attempt of what you're doing right now, how would you fit into this discussion? Would it be like preliminary book, introductory book, or can be like standalone, like guidance, again to enhance the importance of understanding Prema and hunkering? How would you place this book?
I mean, it's, as the name, it's upadesh. It's some practical instructions, principally. So it governs, some practical matters of, what is favorable, what is unfavorable, what are the challenges to be avoided, behaviors to be avoided, and what are the principal practices, 7 and 8, in presence of the name and importance of the sadhana process, right? And then the later 3 verses give some overview of the Vaishishta of Krishna, of Radha Krishna Leela. So, it's a very valuable, concise set of guidelines. And, it's important to go through and understand, but then there's, then you can apply them. You can apply the practical stuff in your life, and you can then go into the literature that describes that object and nourishes the aspiration for that ontological supreme existent that is exalted by the later 3 verses.
Right. So why I'm asking about this, because you mentioned Baba's quoting, giving this example of turtles swimming in Ganga every single day, and Yamuna, and reflecting on the last verses of Upadeshamrita, where Rupa Goswami glorifies Radha Kund and the water of Radha Kund, that if you take bath once in this Radha Kund, you obtain Prema. And we know that there's quite an issue with that in some groups, perhaps, or maybe this notion that, okay, everybody some members may think, just take bath once and being privileged to obtain Prema. I'm not trying to negate it or criticize anything, but in the same context of essence over the actual doing items or performing items externally, with this particular book, Upadeshamrita, would also hit the nail in the head, I would say, to highlight this importance, actually, Prema over Adhikar. Baba always say Adhikar is not prerequisite to Bhakti. I'm not sure, I'm just concluded this is my expression of, it's not really a question, but just hinting that Upadeshamrita would have the same sound of the point that you brought up with the turtles.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much. If I have some more questions, I will just post it on the chat later.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Pranam. Straight at it.
All right. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe. Shyam. My pranams. We'll sign off here, and next time we'll dive into this next verse, and we'll go into an extended discussion of Ragatmika Bhakti, Raganuga Bhakti, and the process of sadhana as explained in the Sindhu and relevant commentaries. All right. That's it.
Jai Jai Shri Radhe Pranam.